Hi everybody. So I wanted to talk about how they've now put in a ban on men changing nappies in childcare centres. And this has happened, it's not a government decision, this was made by one of the leading childcare providers in Victoria, which is the state where the man, who I'm not going to mention by name, that he has been accused of doing all these different crimes. So I've also got some more information that I believe is correct, although I'm not absolutely certain, about what the man's been accused of. And yeah, it seems as if he had some sexually transmitted diseases, which is why his name was mentioned. So he had at least 3 or 4 of them, and so there was a fear that some of these children might have them, and that's the justification for releasing his name and identity, is because kids might have contracted these sexually transmitted diseases and therefore want testing. So ordinarily you wouldn't mention his name. So just so we're clear, it's not because of what he did, it's because he had STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. So what he did does not justify his name or identity or photo being released, because he hasn't been proven to have done anything. It's purely because he has the sexually transmitted diseases. Nonetheless, because people are hysterical people, we have, and that's why these sort of things are normally not released, because we get hysterical. And we've even seen it with celebrities who've been accused of such things. So think of, Jimmy Savile, who obviously he died before he was accused of anything. We've got Rolf Harris, we've got Michael Jackson, to name 3 celebrities. And just the being accused of this, it ruins lives. I mean, Michael Jackson was found not guilty, and yet he was never found guilty of anything, and yet it ruined his life. So, you know, there's all these different... People assume if you're accused, they assume you're guilty. They do for anything. Let's just be honest. If you're accused of anything and it gets to court, they assume you're guilty. Now, depending on the crime, depends on the prosecution rates, but generally speaking, the accusation compared to the conviction rate is around about 50% overall. Now, that's actually pumped up by certain crimes where the penalty is so low that people just confess all the time, which is such as drug offences. So if you have a drug offence against your name, you're going to pay a fine. Nothing's going to happen, at least in Australia. So they don't... People just say, oh, yeah, I've got some marijuana in my bag. No worries. I'll give you $400. No worries. And that's it. So, you know, that's the sort of thing where they get pretty close to 100% success rate with those ones. So because of that, it actually pumps the average up. Now, sexual abuse ones, they have quite low prosecution rates, whether it's against adults or children. So, you know, just because they're accused doesn't mean they're guilty. I'm just going to say that. If it was the case of they've committed to it with the drugs, I mean, that's the thing. We've had people do false confessions all the time. And in fact, even with the drugs ones, if you're only going to have to pay a $400 fine, why not just confess? Why not just say, oh, all right, here's $400. It's easier than worrying about the crimes. And this is the thing, like, I actually had to go to what they call train court or public transport court, but we just call it train court, which is within the magistrate court, and they meet, I think it's once a month. So I got a ticket for putting my foot on the seat, but I didn't put my foot on the seat. I was actually sleeping. It was a very long trip. It was about a 2.5 hour trip one way, and I was sleeping, and when the officers came, it woke me up, and I was startled. But my foot was not on the seat, it was underneath. So I went to train court, and I actually said I didn't do it, and they just dropped it straight away. But about 90% of people don't have the time to go to train court and don't want to fight it, so they would just pay the fine. And I think the fine was about $300. So 90% of people paid the fine, almost everyone that actually fought it won. Isn't that interesting? So they would say, oh, we've got 93% perhaps of conviction rates, so we're clearly right. But it was actually because people couldn't be bothered fighting it. So, and I talk about how statistics can be manipulated, and that's one way. And also, while I'm here, I want to just say that it is a statistical reality that more men are in prison than women, and that it's not because men are more likely to do bad things. There's nothing about being male, having testosterone, anything like that, that makes you more likely to commit crime. Now, the reason why more men are in prison actually has a historical basis, because historically, if you look back in time, and even today in some Muslim countries, particularly the ones that are very strict, women couldn't, and still can't in the Muslim countries, or some of them, they couldn't do anything. They'd be stuck at home, unable to do a crime, or unable to do most crimes, because if you're stuck at home, you're not seeing anyone, well, all you can do is murder your husband, perhaps, and there were a few of them, or hurt the kids, and there were a few of them. But you wouldn't be able to do things in the general community. So if you're in a strict Muslim country, I would bet that the actual proportion of crimes are 95% men, because women can't do it. And that was the case all around the world until relatively recently. So we've got it into our head that women can't commit crimes. And yet the reality is that they can. And part of the whole liberation, the equality thing, means that women are now equally, well, perhaps not exactly equally, but roughly equally capable of committing crime as men. So we should have, the prison system should have just as many women in prison as men. Now, we know that women do certain crimes and men do certain other crimes. That's a factual thing. Women tend to do more crimes of deception, while men tend to do more violent crimes. So if you were looking at someone getting beat up, that's more likely to be done by a man. Now, murder, curiously, is roughly even, but how men commit murder tends to be more violent, while how women commit murder tends to be more deceptive. Women are more likely to hire a hitman or manipulate someone to kill for them. Men are more likely to do it themselves. Women are more likely to use poison or some other manipulative method to kill somebody. Men are more likely to just shoot someone in the head. So that's a difference in how you're doing it. So if you went to court and you weren't sure of the gender and they were murder, and it was a murder by brute force, you'd say it's probably a man. If it was a murder by poison, it's probably a woman. If it was a murder through hiring a hitman, it's probably a woman who's hired them. Right? Now, that's not to say that men never hire hitmen, they do, but it's more likely to be a woman, particularly if it's not a hiring but a manipulative situation where they convince or trick somebody into killing for them, or even to hurting for them. Women are much more likely to do that than men. And when it comes to sexual assault against adults, it's more likely to be men. But if it's sexual assault against children, it's more likely to be women. And we've explained why that is the case. But statistics don't say that. Statistics, in fact, say that across the board, all crimes are more likely to be committed by men. And the reason that is because we have it in our heads that women can't commit crimes. So we, as a society, and this is all around the world, we tend to convict men and find women not guilty. And there's been numerous, like tens of thousands, probably even hundreds of thousands of case studies where they have had men and women commit the same crime, even in a group, and they've all had the exact same thing that they've done, been tried separately, and the women are much more likely to get off, to be found not guilty, than the man. Even though the evidence is exactly the same, the women will be found not guilty much more often, and if they are found guilty, they'll get much lesser sentences than the men. The law doesn't suggest that that's how it should happen, but people do that. And we're seeing that sort of bias when we're looking at this case, or when we're looking at just about any case. Remember we had the Me Too movement, which falsely claimed that women got the raw end of the deal in the court system, and that's the opposite is true. Because this is the thing, the prison system should have 50% men and 50% women. Because nobody seriously suggests, I mean, I know there are people that suggest this, but nobody who is actually intelligent and is actually aware of what's going on would even briefly believe that women are pure and innocent purely by being women. I'm sure everybody's known some horrible people, both men and women. Are they more likely to be men or more likely to be women? Well, they're different with how they're horrible. But there's just as big a proportion of men that are horrible as women. It's not something where you can say, oh no, I know 100 horrible men and don't know any horrible women. Well, that's not true. You'd probably know quite a lot of horrible women. Now, depending on the person, you might know more horrible women or you might know more horrible men, but it's gonna be around about the same amount. So we should have close to 50-50 in jails, but we actually don't. It's 13 to 1. 13 times as many men are in prison as women. Now again, that's due to the combination of men being more likely to be convicted and also getting longer sentences for the same crime. So, for example, you might be saying, all right, well, women are going to jail only 5 times less often than men. Yeah, but then when they do go to jail, they get 2 years and the man will get 9. So it's for the same crime. So there's an extreme amount of bias. So this 13 to 1 thing should be remembered when you look at people that are saying, well, almost all of the child abuse claims are against men. Well, that's actually not true. It's because we bias it. Because we have this extreme bias against men, or in favour of women, depending on which way you want to look at it. And it manipulates all these statistics. The reality is that when we've had actual studies of people, for example, people who've been in foster care, they've said actually it's the women that do most of the abuse, including most of the sexual abuse. But again, when women do sexual abuse, they don't have the genitalia. So then people say, well, that's not the same. It's only using fingers or whatever else. Anyway, so I wanted to look at this case against this man and the decision to ban men from childcare centres. So, I mean, I worked in a childcare centre. I worked in 6 different ones. Very brief. I was only as a temp. So I know, and I did that very early, like quite young. I haven't done it since because there was so much discrimination and the pay is terrible. You're getting minimum wage. Why would you want to do that? And I've explained that essentially nobody really wants to do it. And the only reason that anyone does it is either they're out of a job and they can't get paid what they want to get paid. So that's one thing. Like if you're desperate, you can't get a job doing anything else, you'll do that. It's a bit like why somebody would work at McDonald's or KFC or one of the Woolworths or Coles or any of those places that don't pay you very well. That's what working in a childcare centre is like. You're paid minimum wage. And, other people will be paid 5 times that for probably the same amount of effort. So you would prefer to be working somewhere that pays more. Of course you would. You're not choosing to work there. Now, you might choose to work there compared to some other minimum wage job. But, if you had a choice realistically between working in a childcare centre, which is quite difficult work, quite physically demanding, you got that versus working in Coles, where, the expectations are not particularly high, and you're competing with 14-year-olds. To be working in a childcare centre, there's all sorts of restrictions about it. You have to be over a certain age. They won't let 14-year-olds do it. So that's already make it harder than working at Coles or Woolworths or KFC, who let 14-year-olds work. The training is a lot harder. You had to get working with children checks. You have to do courses and all sorts of things for a minimum wage job. It's a lot of effort for so little reward. They should be paying more. Not for everybody. For everybody that works there, they should be paying more. And not only that, it should be at least partially government subsidised. I've explained this before, that I believe that childcare centres should be treated the same way as schools, in that there should be a public and a private version. So by all means, if you have the money and you want to pay for what's presumably better quality, you get the private version. But if you haven't got the money, you should be allowed to get the public version, which should be free. I mean, you go to school, yeah, sure, you have to pay for books, you have to pay for, there's fees, it's like $100 or however much it is, it's probably more than that now. But private school's a lot more. The difference is enormous. And there's different levels of private school for how much they charge. Catholic schools tend to be cheaper than non-Catholic schools or ones that aren't religious. But it does vary a lot. I mean, you get ones that are $18,000 a year and ones that are $150,000 a year. Who can afford $150,000 a year to put your kid at school when the average wage is $70,000? That means both of you are working full-time on an average wage, $70,000, and that still doesn't pay for the school fees, let alone anything else, and that's for one child. Who can do that? No, you can't. You'd have to be somebody that's getting a high income. And they do have those schools. Now, this is the problem, is that you only get so much time off for maternity leave. And I think it's about 9 months. So you would normally get 3 months, the last 3 months of your pregnancy, because you can probably work up to you're about 6 months pregnant. And then you take those 3 months off, and then the first 6 months of the child's birth. Now, it probably doesn't line up exactly, and I don't know the exact rules about that, but ideally that'd be great. You might actually have not quite that right amount of time, and then you put your kid in childcare at 6 months, because you're not allowed to put them in before that. Some people would love to, but they're not allowed to. The childcare won't accept them until 6 months. So if you only get 6 months maternity leave, you're going to have a bit of time with the kid not in childcare, and you're working, because you've got to go back, or you've got to do leave without pay or something, or get your parents or somebody else to look after them. So it's quite awkward. So a lot of parents wait for that 6 months to tick over. They put their kid in childcare straight away. Now, the thing is, when I worked in childcare, and again, haven't got that much experience with it, but a little bit, it was a long time ago, back in about 2002, I think it was 2002. Did I do it in 2003? I think I did a little bit in 2003. And that was about it. And so it's over 20 years ago. It might be different now. But back when I was there, most of the kids were not 6 months old. The average age was more like 2, 3, 4. Now, there weren't that many that were 4, because then they went to pre-kinder. So the average age of them was about 2.5. Now, they've talked about not letting the men change the nappies. Now, that only applies to the kids that are in nappies. And you're normally out of nappies by the time you're about 12 or 13 months old, maybe 15 months old. And so that would only apply to about 10% of the kids in the childcare centre, maybe less than 10%. Look, it might be 15, it might even be 20, I might be a bit out of date. But it's not the majority of them, it's only a tiny proportion. And depending on which childcare centre I worked at, some of them made me do it. They made me change the nappies because nobody wanted to do it. It wasn't a fun thing to do. Changing nappies is awful. I can say that. It's not something, oh no, I don't get to change nappies anymore. Why would you want to change nappies? You get poo all over you. You know that it smells, it gets all over everything, and then you've got to clean yourself afterwards. And the thing is, when they used to get me to do it, it was only one childcare that that's all pretty much all they got me to do all day. I'd go in there and, because there's a lot of this discrimination, it was difficult for me to get a job. And, which is a large part of the reason why I stopped doing it. It doesn't pay very well. So they'd say, all right, if you want to come in there, we're going to make you change nappies all day. So I'd go in there at 8:30, or I think it was about 8 o'clock when they opened. But I seem to remember it was starting at 8:30. So I went in there at 8:30, Might have got in there at 8:10. 8:30, they open the doors, and straight away you're on nappy changing duty. Now, you probably wouldn't get kids need to have their nappies changed straight away, so you might get till 9 o'clock. Then boom, it's just a train. And I was changing nappies the whole day, from basically 8:30 until about 4:30 when they closed. Well, I think they closed at 5 actually, come to think of it. But that'd be more than an 8-hour shift. So yeah, I just changed it non-stop, and I did that. I think I probably did that 4 or 5 times at this one place that's what they wanted me to do. And they just said, right, you're changing nappies, because they know that men are better at changing nappies than women. Men are quicker. It's just, maybe it's a part of our DNA. Maybe it was just me, I'm particularly quicker. And that was the thing. I would change 80 nappies in a day, and somebody else would only change 30 or 40. And even the good women would do 50 or 60. So I'd be quicker. I didn't enjoy it. It was horrible. I wasn't paid for doing more nappy changes than anyone else. And it wasn't something that I loved doing. I would have much rather, read stories to them, or, juggle, or, do something a bit more fun. Changing nappies is probably the worst thing you can do in a childcare centre. It's horrible. It's not pleasant. And so I can't imagine very many men going, oh no, I don't get to change nappies. That's just a stupid thing to think. I mean, I don't know if that's to do with what this man allegedly did, but it's just a stupid idea that would in any way help things. I mean, let's be realistic. You're changing nappies, they're full of poo. You're going to do that in front of everyone. I mean, I always did. I had somebody next to me the whole time. Either somebody that would be doing it, or else they'd be supervising, because they always needed to have at least 2 sets of eyes on you. And this wasn't because I was a man, all the women did too. That was just a rule. So I'd always have somebody else change the nappy and somebody else just looking at us. So I'd change with someone else. So we'd have 2 trains, if you like. And she wouldn't get through the whole thing. So we used to have, so I'd do the 8 hours. Somebody else would do 1 or 2 hours, and then they'd swap with someone else and so forth. So, it was me and 6 other women they'd all do short periods. I'd do the whole day, except for when there was none to change, of course. So, and then there was a third person would just look at us. Because you had to do it, like they'd be doing something else while they're looking. But you had to have that, because that's a law. You have to have 3 sets of eyes. The 2 sets of eyes on somebody at all times, whether they're male or female, whatever they're doing. And so I thought it was horrible doing that. I hated doing that. That was some of my, it was just horrible. And then otherwise we're not going to give you a job. So the idea that they've banned men from doing this, the men that are doing it are not wanting to do this. They're doing it because they have to. And if you know a lot of families with young children, it's often the husband that changes the nappy, because the wife, for whatever reason, I don't know why this is, but she's often slower at it and worse at it. And I mean, there's some husbands that are bad at it, but, and there's some women that are good at it. But yeah, generally speaking, my experience, men are generally better at changing nappies than women, and they're faster. They know what they're doing more. They don't mess up and get things all around, all in the wrong spot. Maybe it's because it's a technical thing, but that would be the case. So if they're banning that, what do they hope to get out of banning it? And I mean, obviously somebody's getting it in their head, oh no, you're a pervert because you asked to change the nappies. You're not going off somewhere secret to change the nappies. This is on a table, the nappy changing table. It's not in a private room. You don't shut the door behind you. You're out there. There'll be a window so that people can look at you, because you're not allowed to shut the door on them, because that's against the rules. Now, then they said, well, they're stopping the toilet thing. Well, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to go in the toilet with a kid. So if I was taking a kid to the toilet, I would open the door and let them in. Now, for some of them, they didn't know how to do it, So you might help them a bit. But you'd have to have the door open, you'd have to have 3 sets of eyes on you, well, 2 others and plus you. So you weren't allowed to go in with them. So, this is a very strange thing. So they banned men from going to the toilet. I used to hate doing that. It wasn't a pleasant thing to do. I mean, they weren't my kids. I'm like, well, I don't want to potty train you. And potty training, I didn't even know what level of potty training they were up to. And it's just such an awkward, awful thing. But the only ones I ever got to do were boys. So they always had a rule. And the thing is, they'd usually have a rule that girls have to go with girls, boys have to go with boys, but they'd never have a boy there working, never have a man working there. So the boys were going with girls as well. But the actual rule was that for potties, for ones that weren't they were out of nappies, but they weren't yet properly potty trained, so they're usually about 2 years old. While they were potty training, and that might take 2 or 3 months, they would go in with another boy, or with a man, rather than with a woman. Now, again, when you're doing the potty training, you have to have the door open. That's a requirement. And it was never very many kids that had to do that, because most of them were either too young in nappies or they were potty trained. So I think the most I'd ever done that would be twice in a day. I think usually I probably would have worked there, done this work maybe, 70 or 80 times. I reckon I would have done a potty training thing maybe 15 times. So it's about once a week. So you're not doing it 10 times a day, you're doing it 1 time a week. And I hated doing it, but I mean, they're claiming, I suppose, that they sneakily shut the door. They're not allowed to shut the door, but they sneakily shut the door, and then we're in there doing stuff. Now, considering how few men are in childcare centres, I can't imagine them letting him in with a girl, because they're not supposed to allow women in with boys either, but they do, because there's not enough men. But so this would be he'd be only with other boys, or only with boys, and they'd have to be about 2 years old, and they'd have to be the ones that are out of nappies but not yet properly potty trained. Now, this is the thing. You're not supposed to be out of nappies if you haven't been potty trained. So parents are supposed to keep them in the nappies until they're potty trained. You go to pull-ups and all that sort of stuff. So if a parent is bringing them in without nappies, but they're not potty trained, the parent's stuffed up. I mean, you're allowed to wear nappies as long as you feel like it. We used to have kids, sometimes 3 or 4, that would have nappies still. That's allowed. But some parents just didn't do it. So the parents were quite negligent in requiring a potty training thing. Again, this is why it was so unusual, because most parents, they finish their nappies, they'd even still keep wearing nappies for a little while, even after they're potty trained. And then they'd go into the potty training thing. So it was really only a small group. Now, I won't necessarily say it was negligent parent, because some of the parents didn't have enough money or whatever. And and maybe they're too busy. This is the thing though. If you send your kids to childcare full time at 6 months, you're allowed, the kids will probably not recognise you as their parent. They'll feel a disconnect. And of course that's what happens with a lot of really rich families. They have the nanny or the nursemaid or whatever look after their kids, and that becomes their parent. However, that is, and like royal families, it's often like that. They don't really bond with their parents as much as you should. So that's why they don't like to take kids at 6 months. It's nothing to do with the changing nappy things or any risk. They just don't like to do it. The age when you should be starting to send your kids to childcare is about 2 or 3, and the kids should be already potty trained. They should be out of nappies and they should be potty trained. Now, if they did that, they wouldn't have to worry about changing nappies, because there wouldn't be any changing nappies. They wouldn't have to worry about taking kids to toilets, because they'd already be potty trained. And that's what you're supposed to do. But of course, because we have women in the workforce, and because you'd only get so much time for maternity leave, that's not always possible. So some parents have to send their kids in before they want to. So that's the thing, like, the reason I say 2 to 3 as your ideal stage, and why I actually think everyone should send their kids to childcare at some point, is because if you don't send them to kids to childcare at some point, they get to school at age 5 or so, and it'll be this big scary thing. Be unlike anything they've ever had before. They'll be scared, they won't want to go to school, and they'll hate school for the first 2 or 3 years at least, and maybe even for life. Well, if you send the kids to a big group like a childcare centre, I'd say the latest is 4, but you really should do it before their 4th birthday. So 3.5 is fine, but you can also do it as long as they're potty trained and they're out of nappies. You can do it at any stage once they're potty trained and out of nappies. The problem is we can't actually afford to do that as far as you have to be working, and then you can't afford to do it because childcare is so expensive. So we get into this difficult situation for parents who can't afford to send their kids to childcare because the government won't fund it. And so then in a lot of cases, if you're working minimum wage, for example, it's probably cheaper to stay at home with your kids than it is to send them to childcare. So then in that case, you don't want to send them at all. And I reckon this whole furor is going to have a lot of parents not sending their kids to school, or not sending their kids to childcare at all. And then you get the school refusal and you get that difficult social problem. Now, I think you get a difficult social problem if you send your kids to childcare too early, particularly if it's full time. For me, I think the earliest should be 2, 2.5 really, and they definitely should all be out of nappies and they should be potty trained. You don't want to have a kid in a situation where they're requiring the childcare worker to help to potty train them. That has to be the parents that do that. Always has to be. I mean, I didn't mind it when I was helping my mum and dad doing it for my little sisters, because that's sort of similar. But if it's a childcare worker, they're strangers, and it just feels really inappropriate to be doing that. And and I know there's no way around that. A lot of people have talked to me and they've said, "Oh, look, why don't we go back to what it was like in the 1950s or 1940s or any time before that, when men worked and women didn't work?" Okay, because women really only started working after the end of World War II, and it actually increased over time. They actually did that first, before a lot of the other things that women's rights got. So at the time when women started working, it was still legal for a man to hit his wife. A husband could hit his wife as long as it wasn't doing permanent damage. So as long as he didn't break a bone, and even if he did break a bone, that was still okay, as long as he didn't knock her eye out or anything like that. So domestic violence was still illegal, but the definition of domestic violence was very different to what it is now. And also, so that really didn't change until about, I think, 1975. And the definition of child abuse was very different until about 1990, so up until about 1990, it was perfectly legal for both men and women to hit their kids up to the stage, where it wasn't permanent damage. So it was still considered child abuse if they lost their eye or broke a bone or something like that, although even then, not always. But the definition changed. So it changed quite dramatically. And there are parts of the world, these Muslim parts of the world, well, not all Muslim parts of the world, but the strict ones. And only some of them. And also, I think, Japan and Russia as well. So if you go to Japan or Russia, if you live there, you get married there, you're a woman, you can expect to be hit by your husband. And, they're not Muslim countries. So, but then there's also Muslim countries like Afghanistan, for example, where women get hit by their husbands. Not just randomly. It's supposed to be discipline. And the kids will be hit too. And that's the thing, you get that as well So if you say, well, the woman has to be working from home, or not working from home, has to be a housewife, then you get all that too. So I think realistically, we have reached a situation where men and women are working because women can contribute to the workforce. Now, they tend to do different jobs to what men do. Let's be realistic. There are some jobs which are 50-50, and some that are male-dominated and some that are female-dominated. Female-dominated is childcare. That's one of them. In fact, all education, but primary school is as well. High school's about 50-50. And you tend to get, secretarial jobs. A lot of the health sector, no matter what you're doing, except for doctors. Everything admin or nursing, which are two separate things, any of that in the healthcare centre is very much dominated by women. Although they don't face terrible discrimination, the men that work there, like they do in childcare centres. But you do, it's definitely female dominated. And if a woman becomes a plumber, reportedly they get discriminated against, might be sexually harassed and all sorts of things. And I know with certain seafood places, I worked in one of them once, 100% men, because women aren't allowed to pick up too much stuff. So, but I think women can contribute to the workforce, and I don't think it's a good idea to go backwards. I don't think that the idea to have women working was suddenly a bad idea. I think we can work around this. But the way forward, number one, we need to have childcare be free. At least we need to have a free option. And yes, it'll be like public school, where it's not as good, where there'll be violence and all that, but have it free. Number two, we need to pay childcare workers more. It is not a minimum wage job. It's something with a degree of skills and qualifications required. So you need to pay it appropriate to that. No, don't pay CEO level, and don't pay teacher level, but pay between minimum wage and teacher level. So at the moment it's minimum wage, and it shouldn't be minimum wage. Minimum wage should be something with no skills, no qualification, and very little training, like working at McDonald's. And I know there's a bit of training with working at McDonald's. Not everyone can do it, but that's minimum wage for a reason. Minimum wage is minimum expectations, and that's not the case for childcare. So we need to pay people more, and I also think they should encourage more men in there, not less. I'm certainly not banning them. And I think also another thing, let's not have the nappy change ban or the toilet ban for men. That's stupid. Let's not allow children in a childcare centre unless they're out of nappies and they're potty trained. Let's have that. Then, because women can do this abuse too. If a woman was behind closed doors, let's say you ban all men. A woman's behind closed doors, which she's not allowed to, that's illegal. That's not allowed in childcare centres. But if she's behind closed doors in a toilet with a child, she can abuse them too. In fact, it's no more difficult for a woman to do it than a man. And we know that it's a power imbalance issue. Even the 5-year-olds in childcare, and usually they don't let people be 5, but even a 5-year-old is now going to be no match for even the weakest, smallest woman, adult woman. There is no adult woman that I know of that I've ever met that could not easily overpower even a really strong 5-year-old kid. So women definitely can do it, and banning men would give a false sense of security, particularly if they allow that. A more sensible option is to not have nappy changes and to not have childcare workers go in to the toilet with the kids. They shouldn't have it. And I know kids do get emergencies and all that. And I think they should have a ring a bell sort of situation where they ring the bell and then they go in. So if the kid rings the bell, then they go in. And that should be done publicly. It should be an occasional thing where they ring the bell, somebody goes in and helps them out, because sometimes kids, I know, I've seen them when they get their butt stuck in the toilet. It can happen. They fall in. That can happen. And it's actually quite scary for the kid. Particularly when they're just freshly potty trained, and they're small, they fall in. So you get all sorts of situations like that where you do need to have someone go in. But if they were already potty trained and were out of nappies, then don't have to worry about this ban. If they just made it, they could have video security footage running all the time. You know, you can review it whenever and make sure that you have these eyes on people. And I mean, I guess the thing is, if you're going to have this security footage in the toilets, a lot of people don't allow it in the toilets. But if this is a concern, I think you're going to have it in the toilets. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. That could create its own problems. But yeah, I don't think they should have babies in the childcare centre. And, or if they do, have that completely separate. And, yeah. I mean, it is an unfortunate scenario where we have to do that because you can't get enough maternity leave. So, you know, but yeah, banning men is not the solution. It's just not. There's a lot of people that would ban men from being a nurse, would ban women from working in any trade. What would a woman be doing working as a bricklayer? What are you trying to prove? You know. And that's sexism, obviously. I mean, I know there's not very many women that work as bricklayers, but if you've got the skills, you've got the strength, you should be able to do it. And, you know, it wasn't that long ago that there were no female doctors. It was all male doctors and all female nurses. Oh, what are you doing being a doctor? You're a woman. You should be a nurse. And, you know, I think we've got to get over the sexist ideas, and we've got to get over our manipulation of statistics. And, you know, we should be aiming for 50-50 in the prisons. 50% of men and 50% of women. Separate prisons, obviously. But if we're not having that, we're having some discrimination. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye-bye now.